I started boxing when I was 22 years old, in terms of context, and even though I was the most unathletic individual in school, I took to it really quickly and I became quite good at it. And I was encouraged by a lot of trainers that I worked with, coaches, to think about doing it competitively. And there's two specific reasons why I didn't. The first really echoes something Rachel said, which was a complete dearth of female participation in Wales. You couldn't find female boxers to spar with, to fight with, which through the internet has really improved, thank goodness. And so even though I was developing skills, a lot of technical abilities, to put into context, I was sparring mostly with men between 5'11" to 6'4", who had pretty much 25 to sometimes 40 kilograms on me. And boxing is a weight-dependent sport. You're not supposed to be fighting people 3 times the size of you, no matter how much fun it might be sometimes. So that was the first reason why I couldn't develop beyond a level. The second is, as I started boxing, I also started my PhD, and I'd taken on a visiting lectureship at the university. And I was nervous about the stigma that boxing attracted, female boxing in particular attracted. I was worried what it might look like to have a split lip or a bruised eye, which is something that one of the individuals I'll talk about actually reflects on in their book. So without too much further ado, so the first project, Fighting Boxing's Narratives then, Boxing and Performance Mimetic Hauntings is a book written by myself and my colleague Dr. Solomon Lennox. And in that book, we made the case that boxing is both obsessed with and haunted by its own histories. Female-orientated narratives are absent or obscured in the history of boxing, wherein male narratives are typically written onto the bodies of female participants. We argued that femininity is a threat to the traditions and institutions of boxing. And for the most part, female boxers cannot be understood as both feminine and capable of competing at the same level as male boxers. So women who choose to resist the stereotyping caricatures which construct them as either subordinate to or monstrous in comparison with their male peers risk dismissal, ridicule, condemnation, and this is from the promoters and audiences on whom their viability as performers depend. So against this backdrop, I utilise queer, feminist and critical race methods and practices to work with female boxers to develop alternative, less visible, more diverse narratives of boxing. This is the boxer I was telling you about with the black eye on the front cover of Vogue, not this image, but a different one. So even though boxer, activist and model Ramla Ali suggests that women make the most creative fighters, for the most part, public narratives and artistic depictions of their work tend to be reductive, sensationalized and tokenistic. For years, boxing gyms have been active spaces for reporters, writers, artists and researchers sourcing material for their work. The characters, relationships and the drama of the boxing event itself are all really attractive qualities to individuals and companies working in media and as artists. Key to my practice and research is ensuring that I'm working with the boxers themselves rather than seeing their work as an object to be studied. So women have been boxing since the 1700s. However, it was not until the inclusion of women's boxing at the Olympics, in the London 2012 Olympics, that the sport and its athletes were captured frequently in popular discourse. The inclusion of women's boxing at the London 2012 Olympics legitimised the sport, opening up new discursive possibilities for boxing and its participants, and bringing into focus discourses of gendered exclusion, inequalities, and the politics of difference between sex, gender, and sexuality. Olympic champions, Katie Taylor, just here from Ireland, Nicola Adams at the top there, Great Britain, and Clarissa Shields, USA, on her shirt, were celebrated as trailblazers but their successes were used to overwrite a history of boxing that is steeped in sexism and exploitation. This long history notwithstanding, without historical context at the game, the narratives supporting women's boxing at the Olympics were built around firsts and history-making. Such narratives persist in the post-Olympian careers of these athletes, erasing other contributions to the sport. Popular narratives of women's boxing are serving to divert attention from and thus threaten to erase a complex history of the sport, contributing to a plethora of contradictory constructions of identity formation and specifically gender performance. The increase in visibility then of popularity of their sport has made female boxers like this more visible in sports media, which is great. Mainstream and corporate boxing organisations celebrate this visibility, though, as inclusion and progress. Promoters and brands capitalise on the stories, knowing that aspirational themes of female success and empowerment are reaching new and emerging audiences. Irrespective of the growing popularity of women's boxing and changing attitudes towards the sport, little else has altered. Remarking on Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano's history-making bout, which took place at Madison Square Garden in April this year, former boxer Jane Couch, now 53, suggested that, quote, "The event is massive, but boxing is still very anti-women," unquote. It was only 24 years ago that Jane Couch was labelled, quote, "an animal, a freak, barbaric for women," unquote, and was forced to endure a 6-month court case against the British Board of Boxing Control, who argued that women are, quote, "too fragile to box and they bruise easily," unquote. The board's claims were backed by a medical team and a legal advisor, concurring that women's bodies were at greater risk of injury and harm than men's in boxing. What became clear was the threat that Couch posed to the traditional attitudes towards women that are tied to ideas around assumptions we make about nature, womanhood, that are also tied to motherhood and reproduction. My work seeks to explore the evolution of women's boxing since London 2012 in relation to these broader histories that have otherwise been silenced or ignored. Sorry, I really should have warned that was my next to do. Before I flip page, there are images of bruising and blood on the next slide, so just in case. So the other kind of area of my work then is looking at the material elements of boxing, the very embodied nature of the sport. So boxing is supported by literal and figurative practices of containment. Boxing bodies are often depicted as hard, armoured, machine-like in popular readings, and they fight to remain contained. The boxing ring itself, where competitive action and practice takes place, is a contained and containing space, something that my colleague Dr. Solomon Lennox calls, quote, "where time-based ritualistic performance practices and mechanisms of spatial and temporal control take place," unquote. So the paradox of boxing then is it makes visible in the most extreme ways the fallacy of containment that is crucial to its identity. Boxing bodies blend with their space and with their opponents whenever in training or in combat. Bodily limits are exceeded, boundaries permeated, elements expelled. So boxing bodies leak, they sweat, bleed, and combine with their environment. Exploring the fleshy, porous nature of boxing bodies exposes the very real, material elements of boxing bodies that are often overlooked in favour of the more clinical and blockbuster representations of the sport. In my work on blood in boxing, I unpack issues regarding to how some types of blood are considered appropriate in public spaces and others are not. The blood dripping from a boxer's cut lip or eye might be commonplace, but discussions about how menstruation affects the training of its female competitors are all but absent. Moreover, the image of bleeding, bruised female boxers are powerful, I argue in my work, as they work in opposition to dominant representations of bloodied and bruised female bodies as victims. I'm talking about the type we see in abundance in true crime series and horror films. So these images of bloodied and bruised female boxers might be shocking, but these women are not in distress. They're powerful athletes competing in their chosen sport. So I'm suggesting then that female boxers occupy an important position in popular culture, and their work allows us to rethink issues such as period shame, violence against women, the limitations that young women and girls face in sport, and how female bodies are discussed in popular media more generally. Drawing attention to the lived experience of female boxers also invites us to question the status of femininity in boxing. Until recently, this has been completely absent or dismissed. So boxers such as Australian Ebony Bridges, just here on your left, pro boxer Michaela Meyer, and super middleweight champion Mae Crews, not related to me, unfortunately, are all actively challenging the assumption that boxing means to be taken seriously. It means that we have to be considered serious in order to adhere to that rule. So instead, some of these women choose to talk about fashion. They choose to talk about their hairstyles. They choose to talk about things that subvert the idea that female boxers and athletes, moreover, should be serious and not talk about things that we might think of as not important or not serious. So finally then, the direct impact of my work in women's boxing is in championing female athletes and women who work in the sport in various different areas. So I'm aiming really to support young women and girls to build confidence and freedom of expression in their physicality. And last summer, I worked with boxing coach and British Board of Boxing Control Inspector Gemma Price to support 2 8-week programmes designed to empower young girls in Cardiff. We worked, as just one of the groups here, so we worked with 30 girls between the ages of 9 and 15, teaching them boxing techniques and yoga, and introducing them to the various women in different sports, before getting into the ring with them to discuss topics ranging from body image, relationships, self-esteem, and peer pressure. So boxing was the practice, and the boxing gym was the space in which these girls felt confident enough to express themselves and work together to explore social pressures they were facing. Even though Lauren Price, a Stradmanach-based boxer, won Olympic gold for Team GB at the London 2012 Olympics and has just made her debut as a professional boxer on Sky Sports just 3 weeks ago in a packed Wembley arena, women's boxing in Wales has a huge amount of work to do to catch up with the rest of the UK. As it stands, there are only 3 professional licensed boxers that are Welsh, 2 of which are active. The national squad has only 3 female boxers, and currently there aren't many women and girls coming through the grassroots clubs, even though there's a plethora of activity there. So the further directions of my work then involve, number 1, doing more to raise the profile of women's boxing in Wales. 2, to explore how women and girls and gender-variant individuals express and explore their identities through boxing. When the AHRC funding comes through, my project Trailblazers and Troublemakers, I'll work with female boxers in the UK and in New York, and in collaboration with a colleague called Nolan Hanson, founder of Trans Boxing, to consider how the future of boxing can go beyond binary representations of gender, as well as how it can do more to support its female athletes. And then thirdly, to contribute to a growing academic community researching boxing, who share a commitment to platforming polyvocal viewpoints of the sport and championing inclusive, accessible, and anti-racist practices. Thank you.